If I handed you 90 days, no more, no less, and told you that everything about your life could be redirected within that time, would you accept it or quietly doubt it and continue as you are? Most men hesitate, not because they lack desire, but because they have been conditioned to believe that real change must take years. That transformation is slow, uncertain, and reserved for a different kind of person. That belief keeps them still. Time is not your limitation. Indecision is. 90 days, used with precision, is enough to dismantle patterns that took years to build. But only if those days are lived with intent. Most people never experience this because they drift through time without structure. They wait for clarity. They wait for motivation. They wait for the right moment. And while they wait, nothing changes. Let me ask you something directly. If you knew without question that your life could shift in 90 days, what would you stop tolerating today? What habits would you cut immediately? What excuses would lose their power the moment you became serious? Because tolerance is the real enemy. You tolerate distraction. You tolerate delay. You tolerate the version of yourself that promises action but delivers hesitation. And as long as you tolerate it, you remain exactly where you are. Reinvention begins with rejection. The rejection of what no longer serves you. The man you are today was not created overnight. He was built through repetition. Thoughts repeated, actions repeated, decisions repeated until they formed a pattern strong enough to feel permanent. That pattern is identity, and identity can be changed. Not gradually over years, but deliberately, through consistent action over a defined period of time. 90 days is enough if each day is used to reinforce the same direction. But this is where most fail. They confuse intensity with consistency. They begin with force, strong effort, high energy. But after a few days, that intensity fades, and without a system to replace it, their progress collapses. This is not lack of discipline. It is lack of structure. Structure creates stability. Without it, your actions depend on how you feel. And feelings change. Some days you will feel focused. Other days you will feel resistance. If your actions follow your mood, your results will always be inconsistent. Consistency must be independent of emotion. That is the rule. If I were to reinvent my life in 90 days, I would begin with a single decision, one direction so clear that it removes the need to constantly reconsider what I should be doing. Clarity eliminates hesitation. Hesitation destroys momentum. From that clarity, I would define my actions in advance, not leaving the day to chance, but deciding what must be done before the day begins and executing regardless of how I feel in the moment. Because decision removes negotiation. Negotiation invites delay, and delay is the beginning of drift. There will be moments when the old patterns return, when the familiar habits call for your attention, when comfort appears more appealing than effort. That is not a sign to stop. It is the exact point where change is happening. Resistance signals transition. The mind resists what is unfamiliar. It pulls you back toward what is known, even if what is known is limiting. And unless you recognize this, you will mistake resistance for a reason to quit. That is how most men reset again and again. They begin with intention, encounter resistance, and return to what is comfortable. Not because they cannot continue, but because they have not trained themselves to move through discomfort. Comfort preserves identity. Discomfort transforms it. If you want to become someone new, you must act in ways that feel unfamiliar, repeatedly, consistently, until what was once uncomfortable becomes natural. That is how identity shifts, not through thought alone, but through repeated action aligned with a clear decision. In this lesson, you will discover how to structure these 90 days with precision, what to focus on, what to eliminate, and how to build a system that does not collapse when motivation fades. You will learn how to move from scattered effort to directed action, from hesitation to execution, from repetition of old habits to creation of new ones that hold under pressure. But before any method works, you must accept this truth. You are not waiting for time to change your life. Time is waiting for you to decide how it will be used. And the moment you decide, fully, without hesitation, and commit to those 90 days, something shifts. Your focus sharpens. Your actions align. Your identity begins to move in a new direction. And that is where reinvention begins. Chapter 1. Then let the first truth be accepted without argument. The life that is now displeasing was not built in 1 hour, and it will not be broken in 1 hour. Yet it may be redirected in 90 days, if those days are governed by law instead of mood. Most men doubt this because they confuse time with power. Time by itself changes very little. It merely passes. Power lies in the use of time. And when 90 days are used with definiteness, discipline, and a fixed purpose, they become greater than 10 years spent in drift. The old self survives because it is tolerated. That is the first law that must be understood. Weakness is rarely overthrown while it is still being excused. Delay, disorder, indulgence, half-hearted effort, confused ambition, broken promises made to oneself, all these become the bricks of an unwanted identity because they are permitted to remain. A man says he wants a new life, yet each day he continues allowing the very habits that built the old one. Then he wonders why the old one keeps returning. It returns because it has never been dismissed with authority. Reinvention begins with rejection. The rejection of what no longer serves you. The rejection of speech that weakens faith. The rejection of people whose company feeds drift. The rejection of the inward softness that says tomorrow will do. There can be no new self while the old self still retains full rights in the house. A divided life cannot become powerful. It can only become tired. Therefore, the first labor of the 90 days is not to add many things, but to remove much. A field must often be cleared before it can be planted. Now hear this well. The man you are now was built by repetition. Repeated thoughts, repeated reactions, repeated choices, repeated tolerances, repeated excuses, repeated standards. Nothing mysterious formed him. Habit formed him. Therefore, habit can unmake him. This is one of the most hopeful truths in all success philosophy. If repetition built the old identity, then repetition directed by purpose can build the new one. You do not need a miracle to become someone new. You need law. You need rhythm. You need decision. You need a daily standard strong enough to outlive feeling. But before a daily standard can be built, there must be one central aim. No man becomes new while serving 6 directions at once. The first days of the 90 must therefore be used to choose one definite chief aim, not a vague desire to improve, not a weak wish to do better, a definite aim, clear enough to guide action, strong enough to awaken desire, plain enough to repeat morning and night. A chief aim simplifies life because it gives the mind a center. Without a center, effort scatters. With a center, force begins to gather. It is one of the tragedies of human life that so many spend their finest years in divided effort. They work hard enough to become weary, but not definitely enough to become transformed. They begin one thing, reconsider, begin another, then return to the first with weakened enthusiasm. They tell themselves they are searching, but often they are merely postponing the surrender of all lesser paths. One clear decision saves 10 years because it ends 1,000 needless debates. It says, "This is my direction, and from now on, my days will be judged by whether they serve it." Andrew Carnegie did not become powerful by entertaining endless possibilities. Henry Ford did not alter industry by drifting among passing fancies. Edwin C. Barnes did not find his place beside Edison by wishing weakly. These men differed in station and method, but they shared a common law, definiteness. They knew what they wanted. They held to it. They organized their minds around it. That is why their energy multiplied, while the energy of lesser men leaked through uncertainty. Power is not always a gift of greater talent. Often it is the result of less internal division. You ask how 90 days can matter so greatly. They matter because a man can, in 90 days, end the toleration of the old self and establish a new inward government. He can stop lying to himself in small ways. He can stop beginning without carrying through. He can stop excusing what he already knows must go. He can stop speaking as though fate were his master. In 90 days, such corrections, repeated daily, begin to alter posture, speech, bearing, confidence, and action. The old self loses authority because it is starved. The new self gains authority because it is obeyed. Others will notice this before the great outer rewards arrive. Family will hear a difference in the voice. There will be fewer vague declarations and more exact statements. Friends will see less restless shifting from mood to mood. There will be fewer excuses, fewer dramatic starts, fewer theatrical collapses. Rivals, if there are rivals, will sense greater seriousness. Society always feels the difference between a man who is trying something and a man who has decided something. One amuses. The other commands attention, and all of this begins before wealth, title, or fame has yet changed hands. The first days of reinvention must therefore be severe with tolerance. Ask, what have I been permitting that a man of purpose would reject? What speech, what habit, what indulgence, what companion, what inward agreement? The answers may not always be pleasant, but they are liberating. For the moment you clearly see what you have been tolerating, you are no longer helpless before it. You may remove it. The weak man bargains, the man who would become new judges and acts. This is not cruelty toward oneself. It is self-respect, awakening into command. Alongside this rejection, there must be burning desire. A 90-day reinvention cannot be carried on mere curiosity. It requires an inward fire strong enough to make comfort seem cheap. The listener must not merely admire a higher life, he must begin wanting it more than he wants the old excuses. That desire must be tied to the chief aim. It must be spoken. It must be pictured. It must be revived daily. A weak wish will not survive the first resistance. A burning desire will. That is why all achievement begins not only with thought, but with emotionalized thought turned toward a definite end. So let the affirmations of the first stage be plain and forceful. I am the master of my fate. I control my thoughts. I act with purpose. I persist until I succeed. And this must also be said until it begins to sound like identity rather than mere aspiration. I am the type of person who is disciplined, focused, confident, successful, and unstoppable. Do not dismiss such lines as ornaments. Repeated with feeling and joined to conduct, they become instruction to the subconscious mind. The old self was built by repeated suggestion of weakness. The new self must be built by repeated suggestion of strength, backed by repeated acts of obedience. If words are spoken and denied by action, they remain thin. If words are spoken and confirmed by action, they gather force. That is why the 90 days must be lived, not merely admired. The first victory, then, is inward government. The listener chooses the aim, rejects the old tolerances, speaks the new law, and begins at once to live by a firmer standard. No dramatic trumpet needs sound. The world may see little at first, yet the great matter has begun. The old man has lost the right to rule unchallenged. The new man has been declared. And once that declaration is repeated through conduct, even the unseen parts of the mind begin adjusting to the new order. That is why a man may truly become someone new in 90 days. Not because time is magical, but because law, when obeyed, is swift in its first rewards. Chapter 2. Now, once the aim has been chosen and the old tolerances judged, the second great necessity appears. Structure must replace mood. If the 90 days are left to the temper of emotion, they will fail. For some mornings, enthusiasm will be abundant, and on others, resistance will appear like a wall. If action depends upon feeling, then action will vary with weather, and anything governed by weather cannot build a new life. The new life must be built by law. That law must say what shall be done, whether delight is present or absent. Most men confuse intensity with discipline. They begin with force and mistake that force for permanence. But intensity alone is unreliable. It burns brightly and then often fades. Structure is greater because structure carries a man when emotional fire is low. Therefore, the day must be decided in advance. Duties must be named before the hour of temptation arrives. The chief labor must not be left for negotiation in the moment. Decision must already have spoken. This is why clarity eliminates hesitation. One does not debate what has already been settled under calmer authority. The listener who would become new in 90 days must therefore create a daily law. There must be a fixed time for the central work, fixed standards for conduct, fixed refusals, fixed affirmations, fixed review. This may sound plain, and it is. Yet plain laws obeyed are stronger than grand ideas admired and ignored. A man saves 10 years when he stops waking to reconsider what he already knows should be done. He saves 20 when he no longer requires emotional permission to keep his word. He saves 30 when the whole structure of his life begins serving purpose rather than appetite. There is a mighty connection here to autosuggestion. A man becomes what he repeatedly says and does. If he says, "I act when I feel strong," then weakness is already half accepted. If he says, "I act because I have decided," and he proves it by action, then the subconscious mind receives a new command. This deeper mind does not long resist repeated orders joined to emotional conviction and visible conduct. It begins to assist. What first felt forced begins later to feel proper. That is one of the great rewards of law. Discipline eventually reduces friction because identity has begun to shift. The mornings and evenings of these 90 days should therefore become sacred points of order. The morning begins with command, the chief aim restated, the principal duty named, the inner identity recalled, the will aligned before the world's distractions intrude. The evening ends with review. Where was the law obeyed? Where weakened? What must be corrected tomorrow? What thought must be planted before sleep so that the night itself may assist rather than weaken the next day? Thus, a man stops living accidentally and begins living administratively as one governing an estate entrusted to him. This government is necessary because two old enemies will rise against reinvention with unusual persistence: the fear of poverty and the fear of criticism. The fear of poverty whispers that great seriousness is dangerous, that one ought not risk too much inwardly or outwardly, that it is safer to remain small and preserve present comfort. The fear of criticism whispers that change will invite comment, that others will laugh if one becomes too deliberate, too ambitious, too unlike the old self. These fears are among the 6 ghosts of fear because they haunt the mind and make retreat appear wise. Henry Ford endured ridicule because he was more loyal to purpose than to the opinions of doubters. Rockefeller built not by softness, but by inward discipline and exactness. Lincoln carried sorrows and opposition that would have bent weaker men into surrender, yet continued. Such men show that greatness does not require freedom from criticism. It requires superiority to criticism, nor does it require the absence of risk. It requires a purpose greater than the comfort risk seems to threaten. The listener must learn this law early in the 90 days, or the old fears will keep reopening the door to the old self. Others will react as this second stage matures. Friends may say the listener has become serious. Family may first be uncertain, then gradually reassured by the new steadiness. Rivals may test the firmness with jests or doubt. Society may be slow to revise its opinion because people trust consistency only after it has been repeated long enough. Let all that be so. The aim is not to persuade others at once. The aim is to become internally governed. Once that is accomplished, opinion loses much of its former tyranny. The man who can trust himself no longer needs constant permission from the crowd. Here again, affirmations become useful, but only if backed by exact conduct. I am the master of my fate. I control my thoughts. I act with purpose. I persist until I succeed. And again, especially when mood is low. I am the type of person who is disciplined, focused, confident, successful, and unstoppable. To this may be added inward declarations such as, my day is governed by law, not by feeling, and what I have decided shall not be reopened by passing emotion. These are not merely encouraging phrases. They are legal statements to the mind. If the listener repeatedly speaks them and then acts in harmony with them, a new psychology is formed. Hesitation loses some of its old authority. Disorder begins to look foreign. The self that once drifted begins to feel less natural than the self that now executes. One rightly lived day does not remake a man, but 90 rightly lived days can. The second great victory, then, is this. Action becomes less dependent on how the listener feels and more dependent on what he has already decided. That change is enormous. It is the difference between a life carried by impulse and a life carried by principle. Once that change has begun, the reinvention is no longer fragile. It has found a structure. The old man must now contest not with vague good intention, but with daily law. And law, repeated, becomes one of the greatest destroyers of weakness. Chapter 3. Now there comes a point in every noble undertaking when resistance appears with greater sharpness. This is not misfortune. It is proof that the old identity is under pressure. A man may begin his 90 days with sincerity, order, and high purpose, yet soon encounter a season when the old habits rise with unusual strength. Comfort calls. Delay appears attractive. The familiar life offers itself like a soft bed after toil.